Joe Biden claims that there are two leading causes of inflation. This is a direct quote from his speech. He said, the speech that he gave last week. He said, there are two leading causes of inflation that we are seeing today. The first cause of inflation is a once-in-a-century pandemic. Not only did it shut down our global economy, it threw the supply chain and demand completely out of whack, especially in countries where more effective recovery responses weren't available, especially in those sectors that rely on semiconductors. He goes, these supply challenges have been further hampered by the onset of Delta and Omicron viruses, and you've all seen it and you've all felt it. So let's pause there for a second and address this. So he's blaming COVID-19, the virus, for the supply chain issue. And blaming the supply chain issue for inflation. Now, this is wrong for two reasons. First of all, a virus did not do this. Government responses to the virus did hamper our very fragile, our brittle supply chain. That is true, but that's different than the virus. The political ramifications of political policies, or the real world consequences of political policies, is very different than the destruction that can happen based on a natural disaster, whether it's an earthquake, whether it's a hurricane, whether it's a tornado, or whether it's a virus. So two very different things. When a government shuts down an economy, when they shut down manufacturing, when they force people to social distance, when they close down businesses, that's the government's response, not a virus's response. So yes, there was COVID policy from governments around the world that played into this, certainly in our country and in China. But that's not from the virus, that's from the government's response. And the second part of this is, why do we even have a brittle supply chain? Why is our supply chain so fragile that something like this, a government policy, can completely wreck it to the point that we're facing over 8% inflation? And the answer to that is reliance on foreign countries. The answer to that is the manufacturing that's been outsourced to China. The fact that we buy so many goods and services from China that we rely on them. We rely on them, and what makes a supply chain, at least in economic theory, brittle, is the fact that you don't have that manufacturing capacity in your own country, and you don't order ahead of time. You only order on demand. So you order on demand the goods and services that you think that you will use or sell if you are a business in the next month or 2 months or 3 months, just a little bit of time out ahead of time, a little bit of anticipation, but you don't have a store of resources or a store of goods and services so that if you have increased demand, you have the supply to meet that. That's what a brittle supply chain is, and it's extra brittle when you put orders in and it's to China and it takes time to come from China. Then you're dependent not only on our economy, not only on our free market supply and demand, you're dependent on the other country supplying you to meet your demand. And when you factor in the fact that the Chinese are a communist country, they have authoritarian dictatorships. They're run by the Chinese Communist Party, of course. You're relying on communists in order to have an operational free market economy in the United States. So that is not the COVID-19 virus causing this problem. This is over-reliance on foreign powers and government policies that have disrupted our supply chain. That's the first thing. Biden then goes on to say, and this year we have a second cause, Mr. Putin's war in Ukraine. He's blaming inflation on Russia. He's blaming inflation on Putin. And this was interesting. When I first read this, I thought, okay, is this true? Because Russia does export a lot of oil. We know that, and Ukraine exports a lot of wheat, especially to Africa. You know, this is, when you have a global conflict, it does disrupt global economies. So I looked into this. I dug into some numbers to see, okay, is any of our inflation, even if it's not all of it, is any of our inflation as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine? And the answer to that is, I don't think so. There's an organization called the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. It is a group of 37 functioning democracies around our globe who pool all their data regarding their economy so that they can see when a trend happens in a certain area, is that trend happening just isolated to that country and that particular economy or that region in the world, or is this a global trend? And what the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development found is that the U.S. inflation, at least at this time when they did this study, was at 5%. Was at 5% here in the United States, but the rest of the nations that were part of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, inflation was at 2%. So my question would be, if inflation, as Biden claims, is caused by Putin, then why wouldn't this be a global phenomenon? Why would it only be impacting the United States, or impacting the United States at more than twice the rate that every other democracy in the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development are experiencing? Well, it doesn't make any sense, and it doesn't make any sense because it's not caused. Inflation is not caused by Vladimir Putin. It's not caused by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That's simply what Biden is blaming so that we don't blame him. His press secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre, actually tried to blame President Trump, too. She blamed COVID, and she pointed the finger at the Trump administration without explaining exactly how that could be the case. How could the Trump administration, who made us energy independent, how could the Trump administration, who put America first and incentivized companies to manufacture and produce and distribute their goods here in our country first, how could that, and cut taxes, by the way, to incentivize consumers to spend money and businesses to invest, how could that policy smorgasbord have caused inflation? The answer to that is it could not. Of course, the Biden administration is pretending that COVID is Trump's fault, even though that's clearly not the case. COVID is not Trump's fault. COVID is the fault of the Chinese. And then, the fault of perhaps those who funded the gain-of-function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. But we've talked about that. The problem, of course, is that Biden has spent money like it's water. And when you spend money to the point that he has, when you don't have any money to actually fund the spending or what you're spending, that devalues our currency. When you just print money to fund your projects instead of seeing if you have the appropriation to fund these projects, then that printing causes an inflation because it devalues our currency. And when you devalue our currency, obviously the prices go up. Biden is still to this day pushing his Build Back Better plan. That's a $5 trillion plan. And if it were passed into law, it would add $3 trillion to the national debt. This is why we have inflation, because of Biden's policies. He bragged this past week about wages increasing over 5% in the last year. I said this before, he thinks we're stupid because wages increased 5% in the last year, okay, but inflation increased by 8%, so wages are lagging inflation by 3%. It's actually like we all got a paycheck decrease by 3% over the past year, yet Biden is telling us, this is great, the economy's good, you like this. Well, we know how it feels. We know how it's impacting us. We feel like we're getting less money in our paychecks, and we feel like, not just feel, we know it's a reality that it's costing us twice as much money to fill up our gas tank when we go to the gas station to fill up our car. So this is the fault of the left. It is Biden's fault. It's not arbitrary. It's not because of COVID, the virus. It's not because of Vladimir Putin. It's not because of Russia invading Ukraine. No, it's because of Joe Biden.